Good morning, class. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Schama. I'm a professor of art history and history at Columbia University, or what remains of Columbia University. And I've written a number of books, done a number of television things. One of the television series I'm most proud of, and I wonder if it would be commissioned today, was The Story of the Jews, which was actually broadcast on PBS. Some of you may have seen it. Fully 10 years ago, and I'm hoping, it looks likely that there'll be a co-production at the BBC and PBS for a film on the Holocaust, which I'm going to be making at the end of the year. What's more to be said about the Holocaust? Lots, I promise you. So how many of you lively folk this morning know the difference between Jewish pessimism and Jewish optimism? Yeah. Smart gang here. Well, the Jewish pessimist said, things cannot possibly get any worse. And the optimist said, oh, yes, they can. and as if to bear out my other favorite saying, which one of the lovely people who were at a Seder table, which we actually filmed when we were making The Story of the Jews, my friend Lenny Grootman, describes, he said, the Jewish imagination is paranoia confirmed by history. And who's going to actually disagree with that? As if we didn't have enough trouble, some of you may have caught, even in this wonderful mountain high that we're all enjoying, a horrible event yesterday in Los Angeles in front of a synagogue, right, in Pico, Robertson District, really where it became very, very bloody, and it was extraordinary. I mean, the notion that really what was under attack is Zionism, more on that in a little minute, as a euphemism for attacks on Jews, seemed to be completely, obviously blown out of the water by the fact that an armed gang came really hunting for Jews in front of the synagogue. There was a meeting inside. It was not a religious occasion. It was about selling real estate in Israel, but there was no indication whatsoever that what was being sold was in the West Bank, was in the occupied territories, it was in metropolitan Israel. That made no difference. People actually came to physically attack Jews with bear spray. You can actually find that if you really want to on video. So this was very upsetting, and it put me in mind, historian that I am, sort of going back centuries to an extraordinary moment that not many of you, I think, probably will know about, but some of you undoubtedly will. In England, in 1753, there was an attempt by the then Whig government to pass a Jew naturalization bill. It was actually called that, which would simply remove the disability of not subscribing to the Church of England in order basically to be a citizen, to have rights of residence, and those who had sufficient property to vote and so on. So the actual bill was passed, and then there was an enormous backlash in 1753, great hue and cry. There was kind of wild, hysterical, indeed kind of paranoid broadsides accusing Jews of wanting to impose enforced circumcision on the country, of wanting to buy St. Paul's with all their money so they could turn it into a synagogue and so on. And there were physical affrays, physical assaults on Jews, most of them poor Jewish peddlers up and down the roads of Britain, in fact, not just England. It took extremely weird forms, you think, almost invented by William Hogarth in his Prince or something, or Lawrence Sterne in his writing, but no, it's actually happened, of so-called pork stuffing, of actually forcing Jews to eat pork sausages and so on, which at the same time is merry and creepy and vile, all at the same time. And what I thought about when I actually saw these distressing videos from Los Angeles yesterday was the radical tailor, Francis Place, who said that there were two witnesses who wrote about this in distress, and Francis Place said, I have seen Jews being beaten and cuffed and kicked, and he was clearly horrified and surprised, startled by this. And the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Herring, also said things have become so, and this was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was supposed to be, someone outraged by the ostensible plots that Jews had to turn England Jewish. Thomas Herring said that things have become so abominable that I foresee a massacre in the offing, really. And the whole history of anti-Semitism, and indeed of the origins of Zionism, and I don't need to tell any of you, I think, actually, that Zionism is not the cause of anti-Semitism, it's caused by anti-Semitism, by millennia of anti-Semitism, which I'll speak about in a little bit. So there's an extraordinary kind of moment that we're living through, I must say, has taken a lot of us purported historians by surprise. We didn't quite see it coming. I remember 15 years ago, my mother, bless her, saw actually, and she was extraordinarily shocked by the desecration and vandalism of Jewish gravestones in a cemetery in northeast London in Stoke Newington, where my parents had lived in the 1930s. And for my parents, really, both of them, being British and being Jewish, was so, particularly after the Holocaust, but I think all through their lives, so unproblematic, so much not an issue of actually having to choose an allegiance or something like that. And I grew up with that same sense of being unproblematically English and being Jewish at the same time. It's partly to do with the extraordinary part that kind of Churchill played. And at that time, there was less understanding of the debates over whether or not to bomb Auschwitz. There was more patience, possibly undeserved patience, with the extremely negative approach that the British government took towards the possibility of bombing the railway lines to the death camps, and indeed to the really kind of hostile part that the Foreign Office and the Home Office played in preventing very large numbers of Jews from escaping Germany when it was rather crucial. 70,000 such Jews did actually come to Britain in the 1930s, which was a lot more generous than the American part. But the mindset which said we don't need these people here was pretty much shared. So my mother was startled and shocked and felt it was the beginning of something dark, I think, precisely because of her kind of assumed optimism about the fit between Jewish and Gentile culture, really. So, I mean, as some of us, I think, actually have said in this rather kind of elegiac way, we're almost pleased that our parents aren't around to witness the destruction of the assumptions about a tolerant, pluralist culture. And that goes really not just for Britain or the United States, but for all over the place. Where in case, you know, it's quite true, I should say right away, that the subject of our discussion this morning about anti-Semitism is part of the tragic story unfolding. And in a way, it's tempting to say, as a friend of mine did yesterday, well, it is all very troubling and distressing, but the real heartbreak, the real atrocity, the real cruelty, the real trauma for both peoples is actually happening in Israel and in Gaza. And that, you know, we can actually take as read. Nonetheless, it would be extraordinarily naive, I think, to think that the anti-Semitic spasm which we're encountering and witnessing and going through isn't extremely bad. I mean, when, for example, one of the candidates for the the ostensible prime ministership in the French elections, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left politician, describes the rape of a 12-year-old Jewish girl simply because she was Jewish by young teenagers or people her own age who knew her. Mélenchon described that as résiduel, as residual, something sort of, and actually denied that there was a really serious anti-Semitism problem in France. Then we're in deep, dark trouble. I don't want to go through an entire litany, but it was very striking to me that 2 days after October the 7th, there was a demonstration, even before the Israeli army had done anything, actually, in Sydney, in which the chant, you can hear it, as the marchers passed by Sydney Opera House, was "Gas the Jews." It was not a good thing for me, as a professor of history and art history at Columbia, to hear that one of the leaders of the encampment, and this does not go for all the members of the encampments, many of whom have perfectly honorable and morally exercised passions about what's happening, particularly in the conduct of the war. But the leader of the encampment said that we ought to be grateful to him for not going out and, quote, murdering Zionists. I can go on and on, and I don't need to. You've all seen the news, and it is sort of, horribly bad news, I think. It just sort of goes on and on. And I think a number of things need to be said, really, by way of clarification, because before I go on talking diagnostically, really, about why this has become so particularly toxic. First of all, again, to repeat myself, saying there's a sense in which really, there hadn't been a problem until Israel came along, and that Zionism, in some sense, was the generator of modern anti-Semitism. That's a slightly weird account of the origins of the final solution of the Holocaust. And never mind the centuries of dehumanizing anti-Semitism, which I'm going to talk about in just a bit. But I think that by way of clarification, and if you do disagree with me, do feel free to say so right now, Socratically. We're in the Ideas Festival. If you want to shout at me, then I'm not interested. If you want to make a point at me, absolutely, I will hear you for a few minutes, although, of course, saying this to an audience which may possibly include one or two Jews is an invitation for people to make a speech, of course, actually. My favorite moment when that happened, because we all need a bit of comic digression, I think, God knows, was at a talk I gave a long time ago in memory of a colleague and friend of mine called Eli Kaduri, who was the great historian of the Middle East, really, but also particularly of the Iraqi Jewish community, which he had been a member of. And he grew up during the so-called Farhud, the terrible pogrom in Baghdad in 1941, which killed 300 Jews and wounded thousands. Lest you think that it's all been hunky-dory for Jews in Muslim societies. And so I talked a bit about the Farhud, and this was at the British Academy, and I was being introduced by a brilliant professor who happened to be an ex-student of mine, and that didn't make him brilliant. He was brilliant before at least I didn't turn out to do any damage to him. But I noticed there were a few Jews in the audience. It was a public lecture. And so I said this to Dominic, my host, and we invited, after I'd finished talking, it was mostly about archaeology, actually, we invited questions. And there at the very back of the room, a shiny bald head rose and said, "You said Eli Kaduri was in Baghdad in the summer of 1941. I remember my Uncle Mendel saying he wasn't there at all." And seconds later, another very small lady with a very bright red hair dye job got up and said, "I knew your Uncle Mendel. He couldn't remember if he had his trousers on." So that can be what happens when you invite questions. Where was I? I was in a darker place. So, by way of clarification, and again, it may just be telling you something you don't know, but it may be something you'll want to if you encounter the most ferocious accusations against what Israel is doing. I, as you probably all know, am no defender of Benjamin Netanyahu, quite the reverse, and have been a fierce critic, not that he'll have noticed, I don't think, over many years. But there are some things that need to be sorted out. Genocide, the major accusations, which are the chants you hear in all of the encampments and student demonstrations. Israel's conduct of the war has resulted in terrible deaths, a terrible toll of deaths, all of which are to be civilian deaths, all of which are to be grieved and lamented quite as fiercely as the horrific toll of casualties on October the 7th by Hamas. The civilian casualty rate is as monstrous and upsetting and distressing as it is, because Hamas makes no bones, really, about embedding themselves in mosques and synagogues and schools. And we can hold these two thoughts in our heads at the same time, I think, dear friends. On the one hand, it's possible to feel, deeply compassionate and horrified, really, by this toll of civilian death in Gaza, and at the same time, not to describe it as a genocide. genocide is 35,000 people killed in Jews killed in Babi Yar in 1.5 days. Genocide of 20,000 people gassed in a single day at Auschwitz. Genocide was 18,000 people killed by shooting in a single morning at Majdanek and the so-called Harvest Festival of 1941. But the numbers aren't the story, of course. Genocide is the planned, systematic, executed, intentional extermination of an entire people. And whatever's wrong with the Israeli acts of defense against what happened on October the 7th, it is most emphatically not that. Apartheid. Is it the case that Israel is an apartheid state? It is absolutely true that bitterly unequal conditions exist for Palestinians in occupied territories. It is also incontrovertibly true that metropolitan Israel, as we'll call it, Israel proper, is not an apartheid state. That it comes as a surprise to many people with whom you have a reasoned discussion to discover that there is a Palestinian Arab-Israeli Supreme Court justice, that Arab Israelis can vote, that they are members of the Knesset, that they were part of the previous government coalition under Naftali Bennett, no soft liberal, and Yair Lapid. And wherever you go in Israel, actually, the dean of Haifa University is an Israeli Arab. I think actually sort of more important than that, there are experiences. Is Aziz, are you here? Aziz, we met for dinner last night. No, Aziz is a Palestinian living in the United States who was born in Jerusalem. And he and I share a kind of practical working relationship with one of any number of organizations, and the important word is practical, which are both Palestinian and Israeli. I will sell you a pitch here for a wonderful organization called Hand in Hand. Hand in Hand is an organization of schools. We have 6 of them up and down Israel, where students are taught in Hebrew and Arabic. They're Palestinian students and Jewish students. The governing boards are Palestinian and Israeli. This is from pre-K through to high school. There's a magnificent new high school for both communities of people, which is just graduation. I think it's first class in its new building. Another organization called, and look it up Hand in Hand, Eco Peace, which is an organization, as the name suggests, of environmental cooperation. And we have offices in Ramallah, in Tel Aviv, and in Amman, because we're all sharing, the region are sharing catastrophic problems which are self-evidently shared about water and various kinds of environmental pollution. And sometimes I asked Nada, our Palestinian colleague, how she deals with the heartbreaking politics. And I asked Enji Wadat, the Palestinian vice principal of the Jerusalem school, and they say, we have work to get on with. We have practical work to get on with. There are many, many more instances. I'm not Pollyanna about this. Are they typical, particularly in the aftermath of October the 7th? No, they are not. But they are at least a genuine, the wonderful writer Amos Oz describes as a spoonful. Amos Oz, you may remember, at the end of his book, Dear Fanatic, said, well, when there's a fire, you want to try and rush. You don't want to pour, gasoline on the flames. You want to try and kind of rush with the bucket. And if you don't have a bucket, rush with a cup. And if you don't have a cup, rush with a spoonful of water. And these are the institutions I've been talking about, which are the opposite from what an apartheid society is, are spoonfuls of hope, and to be commended and helped and supported, and I hope you will. Then third on the list of mistakes to be clarified, I think, is the notion that Israel is a colonial settler state. This is the line millions of undergraduates are getting, actually, from reading Ilan Pape, particularly, the most factually unreliable book of a history of Palestine and Zionism ever written or perpetrated. First of all, it comes as a surprise to many people who think of Israel as a kind of exemplum of a kind of white imperialist state, to discover that over 60% of Israelis come from what still is the Arab world, come from and Ethiopia and South Asia, from India, but also from Iraq and Tunisia and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and so on. So they're hardly their descendants are hardly the essence, actually, of a white imperialist state. But most crucially, of course, the defining characteristic of a colonizing society is that they can go back somewhere to their metropolitan home. The French Pieds Noirs could go back to France from Algeria. The Brits could go from India and East Africa back to Britain. Israel was built by people who were destitute or refugees fleeing persecution. Our Nakba, which uprooted, ethnically cleansed nearly 1 million Jews from Arab states, had nowhere to go back to unless they wanted their property to be confiscated and their uncles and aunts and grandfathers to be seen hanging from gallows in the countries from which they'd come. This is not a colonial settler state. The other characteristic, of course, of empires is that you go there, plant yourself there, and you exploit the indigenous labor, enslaved or not. The kibbutzim and the moshavim and the moshavat were obsessed, fanatic, overly fanatic about not doing that, about having Jews be the laborers in this place. And the other related question is that somehow, from these hideous cries, go back to Poland, go back to Germany, the notion really that the Jews are not indigenous to the region, not indigenous to Palestine, Eretz, the Holy Land. Where do they think Hebrew came from? Poland? It's just a product of phenomenal ignorance of Jewish history. And the notion really that there is no evidence that the Jews really had anything, they weren't part of Jerusalem, is belied by every, kind of archaeological evidence you can imagine. And there also the sense is, that was a very long time ago, and they disappeared. And they didn't disappear. The first synagogues in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century are all in Galilee and in Jezreel and so on. You can take them there for a big surprise. They don't really know about Jewish Sepharad and Tiberia in the 16th century, or indeed at the time of the Arab conquest as well. In both the 6th century and the 10th century. They're surprised somehow to learn that Medina was once Yathrib, an almost entirely Jewish commercial city, before it was conquered by Muhammad's creators of Islam, accompanied by a massacre immediately afterwards. Jewish Galilee in the 16th century under the Ottoman Empire was not just a place where, of course, as you know, Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, where Kabbalah was nursed and blossomed. It was also a genuinely thriving, rich society, with a very small r, that's to say it was a successful society, which grew cotton crops and made textiles and linen and so on. And so they don't know about the Hurva synagogue in the 18th century, or Yehuda Alkalai in the very early 19th century did not come from Poland. So it is absolutely, with a minimum amount of Googled historical research, it is not hard to discover the unbroken continuity. That is before we get to Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, before we get to the sense in which Israel is the constant and the memory, Zachor, the memory of the formative experience of both our cultural as well as our religious identity, is absolutely at the center of what it means to identify as a Jew at all. So these are things, you probably know altogether. It may not have done you deep damage to hear them all over again. It's something to be said if you get the chance actually to have a reasoned discussion. And one of the distressing things, really, about what's happening now is that, and no, I'm not in the position of saying there should be no demonstrations on campus, there should be no in campus. I don't believe that for a minute. But of course, the lines of the drums tell you something, because what do drums do? They beat out the possibility of an exchange of views. They exclude the possibility of listening to each other's narratives. for Jews to listen to the Palestinian narratives and for the pro-Palestinians to listen and learn something of our historical narrative. That's what chants do as well. You know, from the river to the sea, and you don't hide, guilty of genocide, whatever it is. They preclude that possibility. And, you know, here in Aspen, we are into the exchange of understanding and listening to each other, aren't we? I don't know what the solution to that is. You know, I'm sure that's something we'll be talking about a bit later in this session. So there is the sense also, to move on a bit more, there is the sense actually of why it is then that Israel, well, I should say this, you know, the demonization of Zionism, the use of Zionism as a euphemism for Jews. 80 to 90% of Jews all over the world are Zionists, in that simply, we believe in the right of Israel to exist. Today there was an article in Israel Policy Forum, which I actually recommend as an excellent source of thoughtfulness online, by Michael Koplow, who said maybe we should distinguish between 1948 Zionists and 1967 Zionists. I understand what he means, and maybe he's right about that. What he means by post-1967 Zionists is the possibility of the likes of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, genuinely rabid expansionists. I mean, we are stuck. One of the reasons we are stuck so tragically now is that what is playing out is between two groups of mutually ferocious, deaf to reason absolutists. On the one hand, Hamas, who want a Palestine with no Jews in it at all, or Jews as second-class, defenseless, subservient subjects, the way they were in many Muslim cultures for centuries. It was a capital crime in most Muslim cultures to actually have arms in your home, let alone conceal them when you went about your daily business, by the way. So a state of defenselessness. On the other hand, we have Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are, you know, basically holding Benjamin Netanyahu captive, although he kind of, you know, being held captive by them is preferable for Netanyahu than heading straight for the slammer when the prosecution resumes. But they too want the same country with no Palestinians in it. So this is a horrible dialogue of the deaf, a dialogue of mutual absolutism. So the difference between 48 and 67 Zionists. So the likes of Smotrich, after all, who supported, you know, who was a warm endorser not so long ago of Baruch Goldstein, who committed the horrific massacre in Hebron and is the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, is that the 67ers are really care less about Israel, don't care about Israel at all, actually, as a secular democratic state. Go and look at the, I'm sure you all know it anyway, the Declaration of Independence in 1948, which promised equal rights to citizens of whatever birth, race, or religion. So I'm, you know, the vast majority, particularly in this country, I think, but the vast majority of people who say, I am a Zionist, which I got up and said that in the BBC. I said it at the Hay Festival. I'm not at all apologetic or defensive about this. Believe nothing more than the meaning of Zionists is a right for the Jews to be able to defend themselves in their ancestral homeland, where they have had an unbroken presence. For this to actually, you know, work out, the occupation has to end at some point. But essentially, right? Essentially, we've been caught appallingly on the back foot. To be a Zionist, you know, as in the words of that student at Columbia, wanting gratitude for not going out and murdering Zionists. Just the word Zio or Zionist really has become a form of absolute dehumanization. And why is it that Israel is the only country in the world, not whose policies are criticized, but who are faced with rhetoric which demands and requires an end to its actual existence? I'm being shown the 10-minute sign over there, which is fair enough even. good luck with a Jewish speaker, but so yeah. But yeah, I'll buy by that. So the answer is, and the extended point about that is to say, well, 500,000 people have been killed to date by Bashar al-Assad. 30,000 children have been killed by Bashar al-Assad. There are no demonstrations. There are no marches to the Syrian embassy. Horrific death by famine, especially for children, is being man-caused in the Sudan and so on. If you say this, you're accused of whataboutery. Do not let people get away with saying, oh, but that's just as lazy as whataboutery. It matters, the relative response, actually, to the sort of neutrality, not my business, to the horrific apocalyptic calamity that's happening just next door in Syria and still goes on, compared to the torrents of vitriol, the bear spray response to those who dare to actually defend the existence of Israel, is something really important to actually to make absolutely clear. When they said, well, of course, river to the sea, we are going to, yes, we want an end to Israel, but it's going to be replaced by the secular democratic state. Secular democratic states, so many of them in the Middle East, aren't there right now? As in none. Hamas, those extraordinarily powerful exemplars of secular humane democracy. Hamas is the product of the Muslim Brotherhood. Its entire commitment, even in its revised charter, is to a Sharia-enforced theocracy. So this is it's extraordinary that that this doesn't really enter the play in much of the debate, and surely must. So we are, and I believe it or not, I have more to say to you, but I'll and I've only had one cup of coffee this morning as well. Yeah. And I'll sort of try and wind up by because I was going to talk about the roots. So we have been subject to terrible dehumanization over millennia. The first dehumanization of the Jews you'll find in I'm sure your bedside reading right now, Tacitus's Histories, Book 5, where he's describing the Roman war against the Jews, brilliantly, actually. It's extraordinary narration. But he takes time off to say something about the Jews in Rome. There could have been no more than 5,000 of them, who describes as, who he criticizes brutally in exactly the same way that Theodor Herzl in the Judenstaat noticed, that the Jews are hated by Tacitus for being separate, for insisting on their separateness. And what is the separateness about? It's about abstaining from pork, and it's about circumcision. But the separateness really, which freaks Tacitus out, is that they don't worship a visible God, which means to say you can't put a statue of a god, let alone an imperial Caesar who've become a god, in a temple. And it's the sort of mercurial, shifty, ungraspable nature of the God that the Jews worship, which makes Tacitus think they are a real threat, much more than Christians. That there may be something too, there may be some sort of appeal. So the sense in which you are the progenitor of an aniconic, abstract version of a supreme deity is a source of ferocious hostility for the likes of Tacitus. At the same time, he is, of course, incredibly angry that the Jews managed to assimilate in dress and in many other ways entirely into Roman culture. And Tacitus actually recycles, this is totally at odds with his normal rational conduct, his view of history. He recycles some really bizarre views, which are the written chronicles, mostly of Hellenized Egyptians, especially in Alexandria. One who was a 3rd century BC grammarian called Manetho, and more famously, a 1st century commentator called Appion. Both of them were Hellenized Egyptians, as I say. And both of them said the following things. First of all, that the Exodus story is a lot of tripe, that actually what really happened was that it was discovered that the Jews were carriers of a disease, leprosy, and they were expelled from Egypt. They didn't liberate themselves from Egypt. And therefore you have to be careful about Jews because they are walking diseases. This is something which the likes of Henry Ford would say again, wouldn't he, in the early 20th century, and all those who wanted to prevent immigration of East European Jews because they were carriers of typhus and TB and so on. And secondly, that the Jews were that they were horrible secret practices beneath the appearance of being Roman citizens. They were horrible practices. Appian recycled an extraordinarily hideous myth, by which Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, whose overthrow is celebrated in Hanukkah, when he conquers Jerusalem, he goes into the inner sanctum, the Aron HaKodesh of the temple, and he discovers somebody tied to a table, surrounded by heavy catering, basically enormous amounts of food. And he's being force-fed, and the idea is that he's being force-fed by the Jews. It's kind of like nightmare bar mitzvah, really. Sort of, in order to be fattened up so that it can take him out into the woods when he's fattened up and kill him. So we are both a disease and we are cannibals at the same time. We're in a kind of lose-lose situation. That was the situation which Herzl described. And Herzl, you remember, was not wholly, but significantly influenced by having reported on the Dreyfus case. And this is not a happy moment to hand over to Darren and Carole, but here is when someone tells you, oh, there would be no anti-Semitism, were there not for Zionism. Here is what, there was an extraordinary, one of the people who forged the letters which incriminated Dreyfus was a soldier called Major Henry. And he commits, when his forgery is discovered, he commits suicide in prison in 1899 when the Dreyfus case is coming up for appeal in the Cour de Cassation in Rennes, the appeal court. And Edouard Rumont, the extraordinary kind of violently anti-Semitic journalist and editor, creates a kind of fund for the widow of Major Henry. And the way he's raising money is to ask his readers to decide actually what they would like to do with the Jews of France. And here are some of the things, my translation of many of the choice letters. And the Jews were called Youtre or Yupin, that was the kind of slang rather than salad reef. Well, here are some of the suggestions. Their mouths could be sewn up, their eyes gouged out, their noses slit, their teeth knocked in. They could be dunked in boiling oil, laved with acid, turned into mincemeat, boudin blanc, or shredded into dog food. They could be bled, flayed, guillotined, burned alive in glass furnaces, gassed, poisoned with strychnine or rat poison. Their skins could be tanned and made into military drums, boots, or parchment to write on. Since they seem to be so fond of music, their guts could string cellos and violins. One person who identified proudly as an anti-Semite, a medical student, said he wanted Jews rather than some innocent rabbit to be vivisected for anatomy classes, but someone else wrote a letter in response to that Jewish hides were too tough and their smell too nauseating for this to be practical. I wouldn't harm a fly, wrote another, but I do say death to the Jews. And there are many, many more like that. If you want one very good modern history of the Holocaust, I recommend one by a youngish British historian by Dan Stone. He makes the point that, of course, the Nazis were the progenitors of the extermination of the Jews, but it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been a pan-continental, if it hadn't been helpers. And I don't just mean Ukrainian and Romanian auxiliaries, but all those who made a fiasco of the Avion Conference, which was supposed to do something about the persecution of the Jews, or the Bermuda Conference, in which the word Jew in 1943 was not allowed to be mentioned. So in some sense, the notion that this horrible toxin, the notion that Jews are not really fully human, was anticipated for a very, very long time indeed. And what we're going to be talking about, Darren and Carole, is I guess what can we do about it? Because one thing, and I won't preempt anything they say, is that while Holocaust education has never been more important, it has not worked out as those of us who cheered it on when it began hoped it would. Anti-Semitism has increased, not decreased, not because of Holocaust education, but at the same time. And I can't finish what I have to say without another joke. That's how we get through it. This is the shortest joke, which a lot of you know, but I don't care, about the waiter who comes over to the two old ladies who've been having lunch at the same place, and knows it, and says, "Is anything all right?" Darren Walker, head of the Ford Foundation, and Carole Zawatsky of Etz Chaim of the Tree of Life.
Thank
Carole.
you.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Simon. As we thought about curating this session, having the distinguished Sir Simon share the history that he did, as difficult and painful as it was important to situate this conversation that Carole and I are going to have. And we'll have Simon come back up and have a Q&A. But I wanted Carole to have this chance to talk with you. You and I met each other through the project we're going to talk about. And of course, it would be in some way almost a malfeasance for me as the president of the Ford Foundation to not acknowledge the institution founded by the donor of the Ford Foundation, Henry Ford himself, who most certainly, as I've written about, was the most notorious American anti-Semite of the 20th century, and the harm that was done by Henry Ford in advancing and in ensuring and contributing to the isolationism and the anti-Semitism in the United States in the 1930s is well documented. I also think it's interesting that the president of the Ford Foundation is a black and gay man. If I were Jewish too, that would truly, wow, that would be turning over in the grave. But it's really important today that we talk about this moment, this time we're in. And one of the reasons we wanted to have this opportunity was, yes, there is pain and there is grief and anguish, and in this moment, we're all feeling it since October 7th. But you have been on a journey. You have been on a mission, and that mission is how we got to know each other as the Ford Foundation is supporting this effort that you're leading in Pittsburgh, but that has global implications. And I'd love for you to talk about and introduce the Tree of Life and obviously the history and the context that brings us here.
Thank you. First, thank you for the support of the Ford Foundation for this project. It's extremely meaningful. Thank you for your continued interest and support personally. So let me say that. I wish I weren't here. I wish I didn't have this job. I have this job because 11 Jews were murdered. I have this job because 11 Jews were murdered for the simple act of showing up to synagogue and praying as Jews. Every American deserves the right to go to their house of worship and pray without fear. I wish I had not attended a trial in which a gunman was on trial for killing 11 Jews. And I wish I didn't know that he said he got cheated. He got a Yiddish dozen. He only got 11. So don't ask if he has remorse, because he has no remorse. Anti-Semitism, make no mistake, is still alive and well. This is the Golden Medina. This is our country. I had the tremendous privilege of being part of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum founding staff. It was history. It was Europe. But when I went through that building a year and a half ago for the first time, I saw what anti-Semitism in America looks like. And I will share with you that that was more difficult than going through death camps in Europe for me, because this is where we're supposed to be safe. So I'd like to share with all of you pretty quickly.
And this is great, because you're bringing it from abstraction to really being able to see what you're doing.
Thank you. What does it look like when a gunman enters a building? There are survivors, there were first responders, but the building was also killed. That synagogue, the Tree of Life Synagogue, where 3 congregations were worshiping, was never used again after the shooting. And what I'm showing you here is the way in which the Pittsburgh community came together and said, we are with you, we stand with you. The gunman entered the building at the recitation of the Kaddish, at the recitation of the prayer for the dead. That is when he opened fire. He wouldn't have known that, but that is when he opened fire. People from all over the community, the country, and the world came and mailed small tokens and large objects, and they left them outside of the Tree of Life Synagogue. To me, that is an expression of what a compassionate community can look like and what happens if we are our best selves. I always like to ground us in why am I here? We remember Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger, whose lives were taken from us. We are building, because it is, I hope you would agree, the most Jewish thing to do, that in the face of the worst adversity, we get up and we create. So we are building a new institution where we puncture the darkness with light. Our architect is Daniel Libeskind, who is, I believe, a brilliant architect. He was brought to this country by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is the reason in which the gunman went to this particular synagogue, because there was a program about refugees, and he is someone who believes in replacement theory. We are building a museum, the first ever museum, with the exhibition design firm, Ralph Applebaum, looking at the history of anti-Semitism in America. How is that different? There will be a memorial to each of the 11 murdered victims. When I entered the building for the first time by myself, I walked into the room where the gunman was apprehended. And I saw on the walls the bullet holes and the children's artwork. They were asked to write their 10 commandments. Don't paper your neighbor's house. Be nice to your brother. Don't eat meat. Don't kill. Don't murder. And our goal is, in a world of hate, how do we puncture through that? Wherever there is a sliver of light, there's a chance to bring light there and educate. The greatest source of light is education. In this broken world, we all can play a role in that. And that's where we break through. We have the opportunity to break through that darkness with light. Thank you.
So we really wanted to situate our discussion in the context of the US. And as many people know, I mean, anti-Semitism in the US goes back to the founding and before the founding of the country as a republic. There were Jews in the United States in the early 17th century. Many people don't know that the iconic Monticello, our great home of one of our founders, was actually owned by the Levy family. And that basically they were forced to sell because of a campaign that was undertaken by a congressman's wife when she visited the home, and then she wrote to a group of prominent Americans saying, how is it that the home of our great founder, Thomas Jefferson, is owned by these quote-unquote aliens? Now, the Levies came to America in 1738. So let's talk about the context here and the context for what happened in Pittsburgh from where you sit today.
So I'd also like to remind us of George Washington's letter to the Jews of Torah Synagogue in Rhode Island, that bigotry know no sanction. We just had our groundbreaking this past Sunday, and our groundbreaking included the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, the governor of the state of Pennsylvania, Senator Casey, Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Representative Summer Lee. In this country, there is no room for the hatred of Jews or others. I would like to share that we feel at the Tree of Life deeply supported at the highest level of the American government. That is different than what we were just hearing about, what happened in Europe. So how is anti-Semitism rooted in America? It does not come from our government. It comes from the insidious right, and it comes from the insidious left, but it is not sanctioned.
Well, but it also is in some ways one of the things that we learned about Thomas Jefferson later was while Jefferson espoused very liberal views around religion and pluralism, and he said positive things about Jews publicly, he wrote to his friends on more than one occasion, and he used just about every trope you can imagine about Jews. Now, he wrote this in private correspondence to his friends, and yet publicly. And in fact, even Isaiah Levy said one of the reasons he bought Monticello was because he so admired Jefferson for his views on religious pluralism. And so in some ways, this dichotomy of the public and the private in America, where people say certain things, say these aspirational things, and their private behavior behind closed doors to each other reinforce the tropes, the anti-Semitism, the virulence that then ultimately seeps in and becomes a part of our normative culture.
It does indeed. I mean, I grew up at a time when I lived in a neighborhood where Jews were not allowed to many of the places in my neighborhood. I grew up in Washington, D.C. There were country clubs that didn't allow Jews, blacks, Catholics, neighborhoods with covenances against Jews, Catholic, blacks in the neighborhood in which I grew up. How we acted publicly and how we acted privately, as you suggest, of course, is very different. And post October 7th, what I believe that we're seeing is what was said behind closed doors, what was in polite society we don't discuss, has come out and is front and center. It's now okay to say those things, to act in those ugly ways.
Well, you just showed the quote from Charlottesville, where, I mean, you know, when I'm from the South, and people, when they said those kinds of things, that they would have a hood over their head. I mean, they wouldn't go out and march through the streets with tiki torches saying the words that they said. So it has been normalized in some way, and you used to be sanctioned publicly for saying those kinds of things.
In fact, that's true, that it wasn't okay to say those things publicly. We see it now. We see what happened. I speak with high school groups, and I hear kids saying, I'm afraid to be Jewish. I'm afraid to be Jewish. I'm afraid to wear a Jewish star. I'm afraid to go to synagogue. I've been asked, are you afraid to do your job?
Do you feel more vulnerable doing your job?
I feel so proud to do my job. Every day I get up and I'm grateful for the opportunity to use my voice wherever I can.
One of the things that you and I have talked about that is one of the many elephants in the room that I believe must be addressed since October 7th is the deterioration of relations between blacks and Jews, which I think for many of us has been incredibly disheartening and dispiriting. And I know one of the things you've really done very effectively is reaching out, because you know that there are Muslim communities, black communities, Christian communities, all sorts of communities who also hate. I mean, they want us to live in a society where we can live with grace and love and dignity. So talk about how you've taken this on.
So thank you for asking that. I often say my greatest job is not to cry every time I speak. Try to hold it together, don't cry. We seated our first board. Our board is 40% non-Jews. Our board includes people from the community across Pittsburgh. Our board includes powerful African Americans in the business community and the education world. Our board includes people whose voices are critical to hear, because anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. We know that. Anti-Semitism is an American problem. And where anti-Semitism is allowed to fester, all forms of hate are allowed to grow and fester. It may be the oldest, it may be the first, but wherever it grows, you know that hatred is coming for others as well. It is critical that we use the Tree of Life as a place to uplift everyone. So at our groundbreaking, which was Sunday, I think the most proud moment for me was when we called clergy from across the city to get up on the stage and share a blessing together. When there was an imam and a priest and a rabbi and members of the Hindi community and members of the faith-based community from across the city, across the state, on our stage, asking that we all come together and work to combat hate for everyone.
Well, I'm not going to let you leave without doing a fundraising spiel. So I want you to tell everyone what you've raised, how much you've got to raise, and because I think there are some people in this room who could help you.
All right, I already loved you. So let me say first that without asking, Darren Walker stepped forward.
Oh, stop it. This isn't about
Okay, it's not about you.
Keep going.
But we have raised, as of today, over $34 million. I have to get to 75 million. I'd like to say that we have about another 15, which hopefully will be closed in the next 90 days. The goal is that we create a sustainable institution where children from across the nation, where educators from across the nation will be able to participate in our programs virtually and on site, because the greatest way to combat hate is where there's a crack of light through education. We have to get to 75 million. If any of you would like to talk to me after this panel, believe me, I would be delighted.
Your email?
I have cards with me.
You have cards, okay.
And I have a long email, but I'm happy to give out cards.
Okay, good.
And would love to chat with any of you who think you might be able to help us.
And the facility itself, I mean, because there is the original synagogue, but Daniel has done this amazing extension.
It is stunning. It is a stunning architectural feat of glass and steel and a path of light, which shows we will never be defined by our killers. We will never be defined as victims. This is a space where we will celebrate Jewish life and we will celebrate everyone. The design by Studio Liebskin, I hope you will come and visit and you will find that it is a place of celebration and that we recreate, we renew.
Great. Simon, would you join us? Because I think there are lots of questions for you and for Carole. And you take this, and then I'll get another one. All right? No, that's mine there.
You don't need a box, right?
Yeah, not to worry about me. You take that. I'll grab.
Can I just say I'm such an admirer of yours?
Oh, get out more, Carole.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions. Yes, we'll start with this madam here. Please, there is a microphone, and a question ends in a question mark.
You didn't cry during this, but you made me cry. This is the first time I felt hopeful for what you're doing. Simon, it's always an honor to listen to you. We know that Israel has lost the PR war.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to them? Because what you just did today, if you could be on TV every day, I don't want to wait for the Holocaust program. I want you to just do this every day. This is what we need. And also, what's your personal experience at Columbia been like now with this going on?
Well, thank you. Let me, the first question is, I wouldn't say lost, but it is extraordinary. I think we talked about this. It is extraordinary since, we have the Jewish community, not just in this country, but, is so inventive and is so at the heart of the world of communication, really, and indeed of education. It is astonishing, really, how we've yielded the ground to the toxic caricatures of... it's astonishing, for example, that the feminist community, the silence of the feminist community when evidence of rape was produced, not just by first responders and by Israelis, but by eventually... by the United Nations accepting that there was serious evidence of mutilating rape that occurred on October the 7th, that most of the feminist community was silent about it. And the infamous Judith Butler, the most famous American feminist right now, insisted on a skeptical view and described October the 7th as, without question, an act of resistance, and Hamas as, without question, a progressive organization. So clearly something has been going very badly wrong on campus in particular, in progressive, progressive air quotes circles. And we've lost the battle, and we're not lost, but we're losing the battle with the young generation. And much as I love and revere the Holocaust Museum and the many Holocaust museums around the United States, something has gone wrong. It hasn't worked. It actually, for all the hundreds of thousands of students who you see going through the Holocaust Museum, there are hundreds of thousands more who call, in effect, Jews the new Nazis. So something needs to be, we need to have the debate about what has gone wrong. I'm not quite as optimistic as you. I applaud and want to support everything you're doing. It's truly wonderful. But we need to have a debate about what has gone wrong. In Israel, it's very difficult. I mean, those of us who feel this way are talking to each other. The difference is between those who communicate and those who sit in the Knesset. With the exception of Yair Lapid, who had a life on television and therefore is actually very eloquent and very fearless when it comes to criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu, which doesn't mean to say you don't have the most profound contempt and hatred of Hamas as mass murderers. So, but the sense of what to do has been captured by this appalling kind of political gridlock in Israel, which is very, adds to the trauma and adds to the sort of sense of depressed insecurity. Israel now We may be on the brink of another war in the north of the country with Hezbollah. Israel, to many Israelis, including my own family, feels no longer a safe place. And this is something absolutely that has not been the case since its founding. Now, Colombia, I won't go on too long. Yeah, this was, again, everything I've just been saying was sort of echoed in Colombia. That's to say, less than a week after October the 7th, 500 of my colleagues, mostly from the humanities and social sciences, signed a letter organized by a Palestinian historian scholar, was chairman of my department, a very good one, whose book is by no means, it's a great scholarly book, actually, Rashid Khalidi, but it was monstrous. It was actually abhorrent what he did. He described October the 7th as a military operation, a military action. There, at the same time, there were students. We have an Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies, where a good colleague and friend of mine, Clémence Boulouk, is professor of Judaism, teaches history of religion, of Judaism. And we had kids coming to us, they were already seeing swastikas painted on the corridor walls of their dorm rooms, who needed somewhere to go to. And they came to us as if they weren't yet being physically attacked, but they were certainly being verbally abused and attacked. And they needed, there was this terrible kind of almost Warsaw Ghetto-like sense of beleaguerment. And I just want to add to that, actually, we want to hear from lots of you. There is a kind of soft anti-Semitism, which is no less poisonous and upsetting and chilling. It's very difficult now if you have a subject I'm lucky, I suppose. I'm too old and crazy and reckless. I find actually the older you get, I hope you all found this, the more you either go play a lot of golf or go on cruises, nothing against golf, or you become a kind of reborn teenager full of kind of recklessness, which is certainly my case, you know. A friend of mine described the age I'm at, which is almost 80 next year, as the springtime of senility, and I'm really, I'm enjoying the springtime, right? Even in very bad times. So it's very hard to get books of Jewish non-fiction published now. Yeah, it is really. Franklin Foer wrote a very good piece about the end of the golden age of Jewish writing, really, which is not just about how people respond to Jewish writers, but also the way publishers and dismayed agents are behaving. I was really shocked. This is a very obscure footnote, but I was really shocked to be told that in China, apparently, you may know this, Darren, more accurately than I do. In order to get your IMDb, in order to get your license print number, not surprisingly in China, a Department of State, in effect of the Communist Party, gives the sanction for that number to be granted to the publisher, and I'm published in China. And an instruction has come round that no more books on Jewish subject matter are to be published in China, which is astounding, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, we're going to start with this madam and this lady here. Thank you. And then we want to give her.
Thank you all for what you're doing, and thank you for your talk. We have an election coming up. It seems to me that I feel like a lot of people do feel that it feels like 1943 in Germany, in this country, the rise of Hitler. And it's so scary and frightening what we're seeing. And I'd like you to comment on it. And I'm worried about this election very badly.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Dr. Darren?
Oh, you two are much better positioned than me on this.
Well, we've just heard that I'm an optimist. So I'm hopeful about the next election. I'm hopeful that it will go in a way that we'd like to see, or many of us might like to see. I still believe that America is a great democracy. I see the support of the American government for the project that I'm on, and that gives me great hope. I just had an exhibition in the Russell Senate Office Building of the work of the Tree of Life. Those are the highest halls of this government, of our country. So I remain optimistic.
Yeah, I would just say to you, bad news may come in its very specific ways, and I don't think the United States is like the end of Weimar Germany. Really, that may be. I think the real worry, as we've been saying all along, really has been about the capturing of the young, of the student generation in not just Ivy League colleges, but from one end of the country to the other, and that's the case also even more intensively, I think, in Canada as well. It's incredible. There was a shooting at a Jewish children's school in Toronto. A synagogue was set on fire in Vancouver. It was really astonishing. But I think actually the sense in which the kids are really from high school through college are accepting all those caricatures based on ignorance, that basically most Jews are Zionists and all Zionists are Nazis, the new Nazis. That is where we have to kind of concentrate our educational fire on, really. I don't have the feeling, and for example, I will say, Darren, that's very interesting about, has there been a deterioration between the relationships between the black community? Sure. On the other hand, where I come from, and I live in Westchester, the two next congressional districts, District 16 and District 15, are represented, I hope I've got the numbers right, are represented respectively by Jamal Bowman, who's gone all out, full frontal, bitterly hostile to Israel, possibly to its right to exist, and Richie Torres, black congressman, who's taken exactly the opposite view, who is incredibly proactive, extremely understanding, and has taken the most horrendous flack, not just from black community, but also from those who are militantly anti-Zionist as well. So I think one thing, the election will be a kind of touchstone of where we are with this issues, among others. But I wouldn't say to you that we are, that an Auschwitz in North Dakota is around the corner. Having said that, of course, actually one of the books of Philip Roth's very uncharacteristic book in its style, but books I most admire is The Plot Against America. That would, you'd find support for your nervous pessimism in that. What starts with, something which we've all been saying is very dangerous, but somewhat contained, can break out of those guardrails. Whether it will do it in Congress, I don't think so, not for the moment.
We're going to go here to this lady, and then we've got a group there.
This might be what you've been talking about, but I read a book a while ago called People Love Dead Jews.
Yeah.
Yes, very important book,
And,
Dara Horn.
And after
Yeah.
the Holocaust, of course,
right.
was the bubble of golden age, because the world, they had Rahmanis for what happened.
Right.
Can anybody even begin to articulate why this time it went the complete other way? And I still don't understand it. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Is there something bubbling down there that we had no idea
there
about?
is. Yes, that we will, again, mea culpa on behalf of most of my professional colleagues, I think. A book I'd really recommend to you, which I think you'd really enjoy, if that's the right word, is by the extraordinary Chicago professor of the history of religion, David Nirenberg, of Judaism. The book is called Anti-Judaism, and Nirenberg makes a very powerful point, which is very close to Dara Horn's, actually. And that is that anti-Semitism through the ages, anti-Judaism, as he describes it, is not a kind of add-on, but as in the case of Tacitus I was mentioning, in pagan, pre-Christian, it's almost constitutive. In other words, Jews, over a long period of time, have been the enemy of convenience. Whatever kind of culture you're trying to have, whatever solidarity you're trying to have, you need to have the Jew as the kind of, as the other, as the Sanhedrin of demons, as Bishop Gregory of Nyssa described Jews in the 3rd century BC. So what is the issue which makes Jews into white supremacists? Answer: the obsession with decolonization. This is very true for Europe in particular. It should be less true in America, but one of the perhaps the greatest issue exercising students around campuses is a wish to be on the side of those, of the enslaved, of the oppressed, of the colonized. And instead really of saying, we take this upon ourselves, you're hunting almost for a particular culture that actually is supposed to represent colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. So Zionists are thought of as white supremacists. Well, gee, we weren't white enough to escape Auschwitz. So it is this sense, each generation has a particular kind of way of wanting to identify themselves with a passion and finding ways that the Jews represent everything standing in the way of that identification. The Jews control the media, the Jews control the banks. That's why you're not getting the real message, that they are really in the grip of white supremacy.
So we have a set of questions here. The ladies in the middle there, if you just give them the mics, and thank you. And then here, this Claire.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess my biggest question is an ask for guidance, and that is, with the sort of dislocation between people and communication, do you, each of you, have a sentence or two that we can use ourselves and also give to our young people who feel that they don't know how to combat some of the stuff coming at them? What few sentences could we give that address the idea of colonization, the idea of other, the idea of something that empowers them to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we can have a conversation about this?
So I'd like to take that just for a moment. And I'm curious, I suspect I'm not the only one sitting here for whom this is a difficult familial issue. I bet I'm not the only one. I have a biracial gay nephew who is one of the demonstrators. That comes from a lack of sophisticated information. But if we shut the door and let our disagreements come between us, that's where I lose hope. I believe that those are the folks that we have the greatest obligation to keep the door open to let that sliver of light in and to keep the conversation open. And I suspect I'm not the only one in this room who has a difficult familial situation.
Beautiful. Yes, this man here.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, we've got to.
You,
yes, thank
It's
you.
actually very similar to this woman. Could you give us, just as we leave here, one or two concrete things we could do to fight anti-Semitism?
I think I really don't mean to be Weasley and run away from this, but I think this is something I'm sure we could. We need to do this by email. We need to do it online. I think anything that we instantly come up with, you can have a kind of potted version of the points I was making in the middle of my lecture about how to deal with each of the accusations. But I'm sure that the festival ideas that Tina and others could make available through the website actually I'll ask, and hopefully be prepared to do exactly that. The main thing is, exactly as Carole said, the thing about demonstrations is that they, as I said, they shut down the possibility of, they shut the doors rather than open the doors. And there are lots and lots of kids out there who actually do want to understand the truth. So we have to be articulate, we have to be brave to actually articulate the truth, really. That's absolutely essential and believe. But, have we figured out a way to get, it's very hard to do through TikTok. One of the things which is most important, and I wish was taught more in colleges and in high schools, is the long arc of Jewish history.
Yes.
But Simon,
I mean,
this is the
compare,
point.
for example,
just not to cut you off, but I want to underscore what you are saying. When I spoke at the AJC conference earlier this year, one of the things we talked about was the ignorance on the part of most Americans, including Black Americans, on Jewish history. And why wouldn't we be ignorant? Where do we learn it? I mean, where do we learn it? I grew up in the South, and in the South, we learned a distorted history of the Confederacy, and but no one ever said anything about Jewish history. I never read anything until I got to college. And so I do think there is a question in our educational system of where does this history fit, so that we have a more shared understanding of our history. One of the reasons I'm optimistic and hopeful is because there are voices out there who yearn to build bridges and are eager to work with you. I'm encouraged because when I look around this room, there are people who are not Jews in this room who came to learn. I look and I see leaders of Muslim organizations, Black organizations, members of the Ford family, all sorts of people who are here because they've come to learn. There are a lot of other options where they could have gone, and so there are voices of moderation, and it's so easy to be discouraged when you see the extremism and you see what you have to deal with. But there are voices of moderation. Sherilyn Eiffel, I'm going to call on you after the nice lady goes.
I would just add, thanks so much, Darren. I would just add that, it's why I think one of the problems with such knowledge as there is outside the classroom, speaking of the classroom as a civic entity of Jewish history, it's reduced to two things: the Holocaust and the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
Yes.
And over the centuries, the relationship, you can argue, this is why I've written 2 volumes of the story of the Jews, and I'm finally, having procrastinated something awful and then hearing that old nudnik Rabbi Hillel at my back saying, if not now, when are you going to get on with it? I'm beginning the last volume 3. But the crucial thing really is that Jewish history belongs to everybody. I mean, I've over-determined in my own remarks about how constant the dehumanizing is. Let me give you one, and there could be many. I could be talking about the fact that even though the romance of convivencia between Muslim society and Jews in medieval Spain is occasionally over-exaggerated. Nonetheless, it's absolutely true that some of the most beautiful, extraordinary, ecstatic poetry written by Jews, sometimes in Judeo-Arabic, sometimes in Hebrew, could not have happened unless those two cultures were existing in the same place at the same time. Here's just one story which everybody should take heart from. There was Ilya Bahar, there was a famous Kabbalistic rabbi who lived in Padua, and I'm talking about the 15th century now, the High Renaissance in Italy. And it was a time when actually there was Christian interest because of the timetable of the second coming of Jesus and the fulfillment of Christian prophecy, when Dominican priests, many the Italian clergy, became interested in Hebrew and wanted to learn Hebrew. And the rabbi was one of those people teaching Hebrew. And when, in 1509, when the War of the Liga Cambrai invaded Padua, his house was burnt down, along with many other houses. It wasn't an anti-Semitic moment. And his library was lost. And this was noticed by the Cardinal of Viterbo, a very important Christian prelate in Rome, a man called Egidio Antonini, who had already learned rudiments of Hebrew, and who invited the rabbi into his house and to use his library and the Hebrew library that he built. And for some years, they lived together and went through an investigation of Hebrew sacred literature together. And the long history of Jews and Muslims and Christians, and indeed other religions too, the history of the Jews in India, in classical Ming China, is part of the history of the world. And it's epic, and it's thrilling, and it's exciting, and it's so bloody teachable, really. And that, I think, is something that, that should be in every Holocaust museum before you get anywhere near Dreyfus or the Nazis, really. But it's certainly, we need to proselytize in some way for that to be part. Nobody should really get beyond college without the understanding that that offers.
Thank you. Yes, for this lady here, and then a microphone for Sherilyn Eiffel, and we're going to be at time. Please.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Israeli. My son was killed by a Palestinian sniper. I am here with another Israeli whose mother was burned to death in a cupboard on the 7th of October, and with a Palestinian who lost his brother as a consequence of this conflict. We come to bring hope. We hope that you will come to our session. We are the Parents Circle Families Forum. We work for reconciliation, and we want to tell you about a program which would suit Columbia, NYU, and all the universities in this country. We recognize the polarization. And so we have created an online dialogue program where you will see Palestinians and Israelis from our group talking about the transformation of their lives from hatred to who they are today. It's very difficult, times are very dark, but it will have question and answer, and it will have a manual, and perhaps that will be an aid to so many teachers who have no idea how to handle this problem. So please,
What time is that? What time is your session?
It's at 3:10 in the Lauder room.
In Louder, today.
Yes,
In Louder, 3:10 today.
thank you.
Thank you.
To the speaker, thank you so much for that, and I'm very, very sorry for your loss. What feels missing to me is a conversation about America and America in this time. As I'm hearing the presentation and I'm hearing you all talk about the things that you can say in public that you couldn't say, the lack of compassion that we're seeing in people, the kind of ugly exchanges that we're seeing in people, the rending apart of communities that used to be together. This is not limited to this very important issue. We are living in a moment in this country in which the rules have been loosened. The velvet rope has been taken away, I can say from my own community, of what you can hear in prime time, what people can say about Black people, what people can say about poor people, what people can say about immigrants, what people can say about Jews. And so I'm no Israel expert, but I'm kind of an America expert. And we are in a moment when something larger culturally is happening. And if we're going to try to think about how do we deal with this in this country, then we have to be responsive to the atmosphere in which October 7th happened. It didn't happen at any other time. It happened in this time. And in this time in our country, we are in a time when all of these things are possible and incredibly dangerous. And so I think part of the way in which, at least for me, we draw together, when Tree of Life happened, and Darren knows this, that Saturday when the first person I texted was Jonathan Greenblatt, he was coming out of Temple. Like, we made an agreement in 2017. We all met, all of the civil rights organizations, Planned Parenthood, all of us, and we made a commitment that we would stand shoulder to shoulder. We didn't know what was going to happen with the new president. We did. We made a commitment because we believed it was going to be divide and conquer. And we made a commitment. It was Asian American Legal Defense Fund, all of the organizations, that if one of us were, we would all come. And so we all came to every one of them, to El Paso and to Pulse nightclub, and we all stood together. So, but we can't deny what these years have done to us, how it has coarsened us. And in a plea for young people who, after all, no matter what you think today, are our future. Most of us in this room are gonna die in the next 30, 40 years. So we can't close that door. And they have grown up in a time of tremendous turmoil and conflict. They have grown up in a time of COVID. We've lost over 1 million people in this country, and we've never had any collective grieving about it. We've just asked them to keep it moving. So there is a moment that we're in that is very coarsened. Young people, those of you who are parents know, look for consistency in adults. Are we consistent in what we say and what we say we believe? And so I am in a period of reflection about how we have failed and what is happening in the larger society in America that has loosened the bounds of the kinds of things that used to bind us together, of the lines that we would not step across, of the ways in which we would sanction certain kinds of conduct. So I would love to hear you all talk about this moment.
I'm so grateful to you. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I'm so grateful for you saying that. I would just add, and I hope it's not too trivial a point, that the internet really is structurally and institutionally ripe for fomenting rage. I wish it were not so. Clickbait is not generated by reason and reconciliation right now. Clickbait is generated by getting people to be as enraged with each other on as little information and knowledge as can possibly be the case. We have at least one of the candidates for the presidential election has been a genius at actually weaponizing hatred and fury and anger. And it takes me back, you're so right, to, we have no Martin Luther King now, or, with the degree of where rhetoric actually is an immensely powerful agency of listening to each other and understanding. The words that come back to me are the words, I'm not going to get them exactly right, but of Richard Dick Goodwin when he wrote the speech for Lyndon Johnson, having finally been persuaded by Martin Luther King and the horrific events on the bridge at Selma to introduce the Voting Rights Act in 1965, I think it was, not in an unprecedented summoned session of Congress just about 2 weeks later and said, I come to speak tonight for humanity. That we don't have. We have a kind of fear, really, of the grand ethical statement and a desperately wretched lack of people who are capable and who want, at whatever cost, to deliver that kind of message. America was built, whatever one thinks of, the Gettysburg Address, America was built on a belief in redemptive speech, really. It came from the churches into the secular world. So I'm only endorsing what you say and applauding it. And
if I can just say in response to what you said about the internet, you're absolutely right, and we should be aware that that's a business model. Right,
yes.
The clickbait.
Yes.
That's
yes.
an actual business model.
Yes.
And what are we doing or saying about that?
Yeah.
And just secondly, I would just point out, since you bring up the Voting Rights Act, it was the images from the Edmund Pettus Bridge,
Yes.
right, that
Yeah.
interrupted the first
dogs.
network showing of Judgment at Nuremberg on network
That's
television that wrenched people's hearts. And that was in March, and by August we had a Voting Rights Act. Now I want you to imagine what we've all seen and what young people have seen, all the videos we've seen of young black men being killed by police. We've seen George Floyd. There's no legislative response to that. There's nothing. So we're in a time in which we're paralyzed around issues of humaneness and humanity. And I just think that has to be part of this conversation as well.
Carole, you get the last word. We're hopeful, Carole.
Okay.
Bring it
and
home.
I hate to disagree with you. I'm so sorry. But I do believe we have Martin Luther King. I do believe we have Abraham Joshua Heschel. I do believe that we do have young people who can uplift our voices and that it's our job to help them. It's our job to tell them, use your voice. We are here for you. The Tree of Life will be a place for difficult conversations, but without difficult conversations, we cannot move forward.
Thank you, Carole. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.